Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 31st of July, 2025. Thanks for joining us this morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. And starting off with this emergency power order here from the Trump administration. What's the latest, Robert?
Good morning, Mike. So this is the fifth emergency power order the Department of Energy has issued under the Federal Power Act. And this was issued to a Maryland-based Wagner generating station, which falls in PJM Interconnection, a regional transmission organization that we've reported on frequently because they're one of the largest in the country. And they requested this order due to high temperature straining electricity supply. And this order specifically allows this Wagner generating station to actually generate power exceeding its normal operating limit.
Okay, so PJM has been experiencing these generation problems. There's more demand than supply, and so they've requested the Trump administration to order exactly what again?
This emergency, basically, they asked them to issue an emergency order that would allow one of their power plants to exceed normal operating limits to generate more electricity supply. And I think that one of my one of my analyses of the Trump administration was that this is good in the long term for basically helping us avoid major power shortages. However, I think in the short term, we're still the Trump administration is still trying to get new power generation up. And I think we still have a high risk of power shortages in the short term. So we'll see more of these emergency orders trying to stave that off.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's good to know. Thanks for that, Robert. Also, one quick thing we've been talking, this has been an issue for a while, but these de minimis exemptions, those are getting ready to cut off. Robert, the bottom line is that all these little packages and things that Americans buy from China that are shipped here, they have skirted tariffs previously. They're about to be placed under tariffs again. Is that correct?
Correct. And this order was signed because the Trump administration said that a lot of these Chinese producers like Shine and Temu have been taking major advantage of this de minimis exemption to get around tariffs. So now they're going to, by eliminating this exemption, now all of the tariffs on China will also apply to these cheap consumer goods that are directly imported.
Mm-hmm. All right. And let's move on to this cartels item. So there's these two major cartels in Mexico, and I don't follow this day to day, but have they joined forces now? What exactly is going on?
Yeah, so apparently the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generacion announced that they were uniting to effectively form a super cartel. And there's a Mexican-American political strategist, Paulina Velasco, and she wrote an article for The Hill where she argues, I think, pretty interestingly, that the U.S. is approaching this new super cartel incorrectly by treating it as a criminal organization or a TCO rather than a rogue state. And Velasco argues that the new Cold War that states are facing is not between one state or the other, but actually between states and these major cartel organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's interesting. Hey, let's keep an eye on that because I know there's been some talk in Congress about doing more to combat the cartels inside Mexico. And actually, I think we have seen some security cooperation by the Mexican government, but previously they have been extremely reluctant, not just reluctant, they've outright rejected previous attempts by the United States to do more. So let's maybe keep an eye on that. Sounds a little concerning. All right. Also, let's turn now to North Carolina with this immigration bill.
Yeah, so there was an immigration bill that would effectively require North Carolina sheriffs to cooperate with ICE in immigration and customs enforcement deportation efforts. And it was vetoed by Governor Josh Hawley, who is a Democrat. The state house is under control of the Republican Party. And a Democrat actually crossed party lines to help the state Republicans override that veto. And I think this is important because this is another sign that Democrats, even at this, at the state level, are not necessarily united on this immigration question. And it remains, I think, part of because it's an 80-20 issue in polling. There is a lot of even disorganization at the state Democrat Party level over how to approach immigration enforcement.
Mhm. And then I thought it was interesting here. This Democrat, a state rep in North Carolina, said all cultures are not equal, which is somewhat shocking to hear.
Yeah, I think that I think there's going to be some Democrats in this, because Democrats have been disorganized, as we've talked about, since effectively the election, trying to how to address Trump. The Democratic Party itself has been kind of disorganized, and I think now this is one example of where we could see more Democrats fall on a more moderate position rather than moving further to progressive or liberal left position on immigration.
Mhm. Yeah, you just look at the approval ratings for the Democrat Party, and it's obviously they need to do something pretty rapidly here. And anyway, this whole quote is all cultures are not equal. Some immigrants come and believe they can function in isolation. And she continues, quote, they must assimilate. Doesn't sound like any Democrat I know. All right. And then finally, let's move on to this USDA demand for. So apparently, is the USDA is trying to get SNAP info from the states, I guess.
Correct. In California, they filed a lawsuit in federal court at the head of 21 other Democrat-controlled states, and they're trying to block the USDA from getting this what they called sensitive information on supplemental nutrition assistance program recipients. And they accused the USDA of violating federal privacy laws, but interestingly cited concern that some of this SNAP data could be used for immigration enforcement. And we've constantly seen Democrats say that illegal aliens are not eligible for a lot of these programs, these entitlements like SNAP and Medicaid. But now I think it's pretty clear that blue states are using state level programs equivalents like Medicaid or to give services to illegal immigrants. And I think in this case, because this is SNAP, probably fraudulently signing up illegal immigrants for SNAP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty important point. Great observation, Robert. All right, let's move on to the global sit rep here. And just briefly, President Trump finally slapped some tariffs on India. We'll see how that plays out. But let's go ahead and move on. We'll stay on India. Over the past several years, we have seen the Indian Navy get a lot more kind of expansionist, so to speak, in their operations, traveling much farther away from India. And now apparently they're, I don't know where this exercise is going to be, Jared. I hope you can tell us, but it's with the Philippines.
Absolutely. So India sent a destroyer, a corvette, which is slightly smaller than a frigate. It's a smaller ship, but still a proper ship, and a replenishment ship to the Philippines to conduct their first maritime cooperative activity together next week. Now, this is not really just an exercise. The Philippines uses these MCAs for interoperability training with, and also additional security from, higher tier navies like the US, Australia, Japan. They've done it with France as well. Now they're adding India to the list. Now, what this does, that additional security, all of this is aimed at the Philippines' territorial integrity in the South China Sea, where China infringes. So these extra ships are there to actually provide, hey, the Philippines may not be able to stand against the PLA Navy on its own, but our allies sure can, especially in any, given locality like that. They can absolutely overpower what's there. Now, this is a significant commitment from India, as the MCAs do explicitly they are explicitly anti-China. They are not, there's no ambiguity about it. Additionally, these are actually operations, not just exercises. So they will be throughout the disputed islands.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then move on to AUKUS. And Jared, I'll just let you run with it.
Sounds good. So the UK and Australia signed a 50-year treaty to support the total life cycle of the AUKUS submarine, from design all the way out to disposal. This is also going to include, a logistics network and a rotational presence of a Royal Navy submarine. The presidents of South Korea and the United States also teased the South Korean deal. They came to an agreement just last night, and they're going to announce the full deal here in about 2 weeks. But a couple of things that they did, that President Trump primarily said, was that the U.S. will maintain a 15% tariff on Korean goods, which is 10% lower than what was initially announced. Korea will drop all tariffs on the United States. Should start sounding real familiar here. Completely open to American cars, trucks, agricultural goods. Korea is going to purchase $100 billion worth of liquid natural gas and other energy sources and provide $350 billion for investments, quote, owned and controlled by the U.S. So basically, here's $350 billion. Do with it what you want. They
Jared,
and
go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say, like I said, when President Lee visits the White House in about 2 weeks, they will fully release the details.
Okay. That tariff deal actually does sound familiar because that's exactly what,
Yeah.
the Trump administration negotiated with the EU. I just want to point this out, something that I talked about on yesterday's show. There are a lot of people, and I talked to one yesterday, who think that the Trump administration is just full of a bunch of Alabama hillbilly undergrads, but they're running circles around 10,000 PhDs in Europe and I guess now in Southeast Asia. I don't know exactly what is going on, but it is curious how the EU agreed to 0 tariffs on American imports, and then now South Korea has done the same. They seem like lopsided trade deals, and I do just wonder at the negotiating table what's being negotiated here. Like, what are they getting in return?
Yeah, we did discuss a fair bit on the EU side, but I'd be willing to bet for the South Korean side, like publicly, no one's talking about removing the nuclear umbrella, but that's the most that's the most precious security guarantee that the U.S. can offer South Korea, because South Korea does not have nukes and North Korea does.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a radical imbalance, which the South Koreans have been talking about for a couple of weeks now. They've been a lot more open about it, but they aren't talking about nuclearizing right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sure seems like defense has to be a part of that. All right, Jared,
Yep.
Interesting observation. Let's move on to this. So there's a Supreme Court judge or something down in Brazil. I noticed where he was sanctioned. He can't come to the United States. I guess any assets he has that are in U.S. financial institutions have been frozen, basically because he continues to go after Bolsonaro and some other things. But what else is going on?
Yes. So really, I think he's kind of a minor detail in this whole thing. The much more important part is that the United States is going to tariff Brazilian goods at 40% on top of everything else they're going to get hit with. That all starts on August 6th. And the cited reasons, there's numerous infringements on American speech, up to the point where it's even starting, per the White House, to affect the American public economically, and general anti-democratic behavior. So authorizing raids against political rivals and Bolsonaro separately, whole bunch of stuff there. Now, the order does actually include, hey, this can go up and down. If you retaliate, we're going to increase tariffs on you. If you address all these issues, we will remove these tariffs. This is a negotiating tactic. Right. Then moving over to Syria and Turkey. The Turkish National Security Council met with the Turkish president and declared that Syrian territorial integrity is going to be a priority for Turkey, and that Turkey will maintain support to Syria to maintain their territorial integrity. They didn't explicitly say this was in retaliation for the not quite annexation of Golan Heights by Israel, but they did say recent regional developments. They're pointing to that.
Sure. Okay. All right. Interesting. And then let's move on here. 65 protests today, probably about baseline. All right, let's go ahead and move on and talk about this 1 million rising. This is actually probably the most important development I've seen in a while. And the latest push here from Indivisible, which is the country's largest protest organizing group. They also run No Kings and several other things you've heard before. They've launched a training program they want to train 1 million organizers who will be holding in-person meetings to recruit and organize additional activists over the next 2 weeks. It starts today and runs through, I think, the 12th of August or so. Each of these organizers is being trained and asked to host 2 meetings, like at their home or at a community center, but local to where they live. They're recruiting their neighbors and friends, family, like locals. The first meeting is designed to orient these new recruits to resistance strategies like strategic non-cooperation, and I will get to that in just a second. And then they're holding a second meeting, again, at some point in the next 2 weeks, in order to plan a local resistance event or campaign. Again, so these are going to be at the local level, distributed across the country. The ultimate goal is to use mass mobilization and strategic non-cooperation to weaken the pillars of support for the Trump administration. This is what they call an authoritarian regime. And they do that through undermining these pillars, which I'll go through on your screen here. This is an image from their training handbook. But they want to undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration and make, quote unquote, authoritarian action impossible, or at the very least, very difficult. So that first pillar there is business. So this could include things like boycotts or selective boycotts, enduring ones. Labor, so that's worker strikes, worker slowdowns. There's faith, so getting pastors of churches to come out and condemn the Trump administration, and also to encourage non-cooperation with these policies, especially on immigration enforcement. And there's education. Civil service is a big one, because they're actually encouraging federal employees who work under the Trump administration, encouraging them to grind the gears of these Trump policies. And then finally, military and police. And a big thing, you go back and you read Gene Sharp's book, which is essentially the Color Revolution manual. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. You go back and you read that. There's actually a whole section on how color revolutionaries, or how these organizers can actually approach and talk to military officers and police officers and encourage them not to go along with the quote unquote authoritarian regime, potentially defect, etc. But at least internally impose whatever their orders are. And so I think this is also very significant. When we talk about strategic non-cooperation, we're talking about action like internal resistance by federal workers. So losing paperwork, or effectively not doing your job, grinding the gears of federal operations down, refusing compliance with Trump administration policy. So there's a big thing in here about getting sheriff's offices, for instance, to not provide support to federal immigration enforcement. Information leaks is one of those things. So leaking sensitive information from the administration, which we have seen some of. Worker strikes and slowdowns. And then there are other forms of what's really nonviolent civil disobedience. That's exactly what we're talking about here. We're not talking about armed violence. We're not talking about even pitchforks and shovels. We're talking about nonviolent civil disobedience. So things like occupations and sit-ins and protests, other forms of nonviolent direct action. And all this is going to happen in addition to mass protests, which will continue. So between November 2024 and January 2025, and we covered this extensively at the time, these left-wing organizers started holding strategy sessions really to determine the best way to address the incoming Trump administration. And they settled on this concept of strategic non-cooperation, which is an old, Gandhi used nonviolent action like strategic non-cooperation against the British. So it's nothing new. But this is a resistance strategy that was chosen for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's relatively low risk. They're not asking anyone to engage in violence. You're not going to get a 20-year prison sentence for doing a sit-in or occupation. It also has much wider appeal. This will probably have mass appeal, or could have mass appeal at some point. So it's going to bring a lot of people into it. Giving someone a rifle or a bomb and telling them to go attack a target does not have mass appeal. But going out to protest or conduct nonviolent action is going to have much broader appeal. And then finally, this gives these organizers, this is by far the most important part, this gives these organizers runway to escalate from a mass protest organization or mass protest movement, which they've already built. We've had several protests of probably at least 3 million people. I think we've probably seen national days of protests with 3 million people. I don't know, maybe at least twice. But they have runway to escalate from the mass protest movement to a mass defiance movement, and then eventually or potentially to a mass revolutionary movement. And this is absolutely important because this is exactly what they're building here. It doesn't mean that they're going to press the big red button, but they've got the big red button on their desk, or they will. On that point, something that I've been talking about, even last year, October, November last year, I did a series of presentations on this. By the way, it would probably be beneficial for everyone for me to do another kind of Color Revolutions 101 presentation. If you're interested in that, let me know in the chat, and maybe we can schedule something. And I can update these presentations that are now 6+ months old. Just throw some more current information in here. But the reason why color revolutions are chosen and not armed revolutions or insurgencies or any other form of low intensity conflict is because a color revolution, once it's launched in earnest, happens over weeks to months. These are not long drawn out things. They don't last years. Like an insurgency, they say the length of an average insurgency is something like 10 years. Nobody wants to do this for 10 years. They want to do it for weeks to months and come away with a win. So that's the big thing. And you go back, and again, you read Gene Sharp manual, and he says very explicitly, the reason why you embark on a nonviolent revolution, either a popular revolution or color revolution, is to topple an existing government in the shortest amount of time and with the least amount of human suffering. That is the humanitarian justification. And now, how do they do that? Number one, they attack the pillars of government. On that last slide I showed you, they had business, labor, faith, civil service, etc. That's a little more tactical. We're going to go a little 30,000 foot view here. They want to undermine the legitimacy, authority, and capacity. This is at the strategic national level. Undermine these three things. These are the pillars of government. Legitimacy is the recognized right of a ruling or governing power to rule, to be in charge. There's a reason why no one thinks that, there's a reason why Trump is widely perceived as legitimate, because he was elected. So that's the first thing. They have to delegitimize President Trump and more broadly the Trump administration. How they do that is a tactical and operational decision, but these mass protests, strategic non-cooperation will continue to at least extend their efforts to delegitimize the Trump administration. The second thing is they have to attack the pillar of authority. And one of the big things that we saw during the first Trump administration was this concept of being ungovernable. And that strikes at the heart of federal authority. If people don't obey the laws, then there is no authority. And so they're trying to reduce that authority because that further weakens the Trump administration, what they call the authoritarian regime. And then the third pillar of government is capacity. So they may be legitimate. A government may be legitimate. It may have authority, but if it can't enforce its authority, if it doesn't have the capacity, the manpower, the money, funding, the resources to enforce those laws, then they don't have the authority. And that also undermines their legitimacy. So these are the three pillars of government broadly that they have to attack. And again, by attack, they're doing this non-violently. That really is the kind of a key part of this. And then when we look at this, kind of this tug of war here, and that's exactly what this is. The color revolutionaries, these left-wing organizers, they're trying to pull a mass of the population from some level of support, cooperation, acceptance, or neutrality into some level of opposition, non-cooperation, and defiance. So all citizens of a country fall somewhere on this spectrum, whether they support or oppose the government to varying degrees. The goal of this revolutionary movement is mass participation. It's mass mobilization. It is mass resistance. They've got to pull a bulk of the country into this, the red part of the spectrum, the revolutionary defiance part of the spectrum. So you see there that has three different things: opposition, non-cooperation, and defiance. They're trying to push now from just opposition, from relatively toothless, peaceful protests. They're trying to escalate now into non-cooperation. It's exactly what this is. So when I talk about how this strategy has runway to escalate, that's exactly what we're seeing. Mass protests, obviously, okay, didn't work. Protests don't work. Now they've got to get into non-cooperation and try to push people from selective resistance into mass resistance. And then if that doesn't work, then move into outright defiance and become a much larger problem. And then finally, if that doesn't work, or if they just get to the point where they need to, potentially press that big red button and try to launch an actual color revolution, a pro-democracy color revolution against the Trump administration or against whoever the president is, maybe in January 2029. Pretty open-ended, frankly. So this is where we are. We are still, I think, probably in the third or fourth inning. And it's going to be a long baseball game. But, it's another reason why, even last year, I've told you like a year ago, I said, guys, if Trump wins, there's not going to be another another summer of love in 2025 because they got to rebuild. They got to push more people into this red part of the spectrum. And they hadn't done that by November of last year. They hadn't done that by January of this year. They haven't done that by July of this year, but they're working on it. And so the worst is obviously ahead of us. I've been saying for a while, it's not going to be this year. Next year, maybe. Let's see how the midterms go. I tell you, this is actually a pretty good segue. If Texas actually does end up doing this mid-decade restructuring, I think that will significantly accelerate a lot of this non-cooperation to defiance movement, which is going to be the next, that's in the escalation ladder. That's the next rung. That's what we're looking at here. Probably next year, if several of these states do these redistrictings, or if they redraw their district boundaries, it's going to get a little Western. All right, with that, Robert, let's go ahead and jump into this redistricting thing that's happening in Texas. So the Texas GOP just released this map, and you can see they're going to reduce Democrat districts down to what, maybe 4, something like that, maybe 5?
6. 6 seats, but that importantly would give Republicans 30 that they think they can win, which would effectively give a significant majority in the House. And because the House of Representatives margin right now, I think, is 5 seats with the current vacancies in Republicans' favor. And some of the majority on paper are also non-voting delegates. So that 5 is the vote margin. But I think importantly, Texas is not the only state talking about this. I've seen not just blue states, but also Florida. There's been some talk here about doing a mid-decade redistricting. And I've also seen in Texas, the Democrats are now fundraising ahead of potential plans to try to flee the state, to break a quorum, to block this map from taking effect. Because a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2023, when a similar fight over a congressional district map in Texas happened, some Democrats did flee Texas. So now there's a $500 per day fine. And according to state law, if these Democrats do flee, they cannot use any campaign funds to cover this. So they're actually looking at Democratic donors in the state to try to cover this fee, this penalty fee. There is, I think there is a really good chance that I think it's actually very likely that if Texas Republicans do get this map through the legislature, this is going to kick off some tit for tat, extreme partisan gerrymandering, and possibly, likely in blue states, but also I think possibly in more red states. And I talked about it yesterday, but there are Democrat leadership like House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries currently traveling around the U.S. in organizing this blue state redistricting push. But some of these blue states face major legal and political obstacles that red states don't. So in this case, if Texas does get this map done and some of these other red states also do something similar, they could have an effect on the 2026 election, while the blue state maps are, I think, much more likely to take effect ahead of the 2028 election. Mm-hmm. I think there's a really good historical example that actually I think you brought up. I saw you bring up yesterday outside of the show, is the Irish Troubles. So after the breakup of Ireland and Northern Ireland, the partition of Northern Ireland in 1921, the Protestant Unionists did not have a majority support in Northern Ireland, but they used extreme partisan gerrymandering to maintain an outsized political power. Now, I think this there are some short-term risks here, like escalating the not strategic non-cooperation. But I think in the long term, this is increasing the risk of this political conflict becoming more like a civil unrest. Because in Northern Ireland, there was about a 50-year gap between the partitionment of Northern Ireland and the what's considered the official start of the Troubles in the 60s. So it did take a long time for this to actually escalate beyond political warfare. But we're also in the modern day living in a world that has a much more access to information, and so I think that we could see maybe not 50 years, maybe definitely long term, but maybe not as long as 50 years, just because of how fast the information on this can be proliferated.
Yeah, what kicked off the Troubles is you have this Catholic town of Derry, and basically you have a Catholic majority and a Protestant minority. And yes, you're right, the Protestants used gerrymandering to basically lock the Catholics out of power. But it wasn't just political power. It's difficult for them to get jobs in many cases, the Catholics as well. And this is not a case where they said, "Oh, are you a Protestant or a Catholic?" They'd say, "Where did you go to school?" And that's all they needed to know to realize, to determine if they're going to hire this person or not. That started basically a civil rights campaign. I think it was about 1968 or so. And it was not long before you had the British Constabulary and then also the British Army start to shoot like fire, just straight up kill, like atrocity, murder these protesters. And that's the big thing that kicked off the Troubles. But yeah, the gerrymandering was absolutely an accelerator of that conflict. Robert, I share your concern. This is extremely concerning to me because Texas Democrats, they're 40% or something like that of the state, roughly, depending on the election. And there are some groups, there's going to be a lot of civil unrest in Texas, I think, if this happens. But also 2 weeks ago, Robert, California Governor Gavin Newsom said, we're going to erase 9 GOP seats if Texas does this. But we've also heard this from Ohio. You've got a list of 10 states, 10 states now that are talking about doing this?
Yeah, that does include California, Illinois. In both California and Illinois are already heavily politically partisan gerrymandered. I think in California, there's a similar kind of distribution. There's about roughly 40% Republican votes at the state level, but they have like 13% of the seats in the California's congressional delegation. So there is, I think the point here of why this kind of partisan gerrymandering become very messy, and a lot of the talk about civil conflict or balkanization can become messy, is because in the modern United States, there's not red states that are 90% red voters and 10% blue voters and vice versa. The United States is pretty well politically integrated. Like most states are, even though they are a majority one way or the other, not a super majority. Here in Florida, where you're not 90% red, 10% blue, where you're closer to 60-40. And that means that in a case like this, where this escalates over the long term, because minority partisan populations feel like they're being locked out of power, they're not a small group. You're talking 30, 40, 45% of the population of a given state.
Certainly. And some of those districts are majority blue districts, and they could soon be majority red districts through gerrymandering. It's not going to sit very well with them. I do want to point one thing out here. The Republican argument is that because of illegal immigration, you have the census numbers so artificially inflated. And this illegal immigrants who should not be here are giving a lot more political power to Democrats. What they effectively done is lowered the value of citizenship, or lowered the value of actually living and being in this country, and also disenfranchised the value of your vote, or the value of your representation, because so many illegals are being represented. So I think the Republican argument here is, well, if Democrats are going to do this through political warfare and try to artificially expand their power, we can't do nothing about it. And so I don't know. This is like what was that? I forget. You know what? What was the Genghis Khan quote? Something like you basically I've been sent to punish you for your sins, or something like. If your sins had not been so great, I wouldn't be here, or something like that. I feel like in Texas we're kind of here. So alarming, concerning, certainly a precursor to civil unrest and potentially political violence. So thanks for that. Thanks for the update, Robert. And then let's go ahead and move on here to the Philippines formalizing the Japanese military. So the Japanese military is constitutionally prohibited. On paper,
Yeah.
but they have been expanding their military. And why does Philippines support for that matter?
So the reason this matters is exactly what the Philippine Foreign Secretary here is saying, and she did say this to Japanese media too. She said it in an interview with I think it was Kyoto News. So, what it is, the Japanese in World War II, they had Imperial Japan with a lot of interesting activities around the Asian Pacific. They were not exactly well liked. Philippines particularly. She's told them there will be no emotional hangup despite the Japanese occupation of the Philippines in the 40s. Now, just to give a little bit of background, yes, the Japanese constitution currently prohibits Japan from maintaining a military, but it even goes so far as to demand that Japan, quoting here, forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Pretty explicit here, like, hey, we're not supposed to be involved. But there's a lot of gray areas here because you can't really be sovereign in any capacity if you don't have a military here. So they've obviously been building it up. Now, why this matters, this is an incredible diplomatic move from the Philippines. It's saying we're going to just let bygones be bygones. We're moving on because the world has changed. We need you. That opens up a door for everybody else that was subject to the same occupation of Imperial Japan to do the same thing. South Korea can let it go, which we've actually seen a little bit of better relations between South Korea and Japan in recent years. Taiwan, I think Taiwan, we can say, is let it go because they're always working with Japan at this point. A lot of the other smaller Pacific islands, they can okay, look, the Philippines, they're saying it. We can say it too. We need you. That allows Japan to much more rapidly build up its military. And I think most importantly, what this does, since it is a legal gray area in Japan and the main security threat, China loves to exploit legal gray areas to, conduct gray zone warfare. That would shut this down if they legalize it. If they say, no, we have a military, this is the Japanese Navy now, this is the Japanese Army, they are legally recognized, there's nothing, everything's above board. There's no way that China can then exploit that to, foment unrest in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an important point, and it is interesting to look at these governments say, let's let bygones be bygones. This is not the same Japan. It's not the same Imperial Japan. All right.
Yeah.
So thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on. And I think we got to get some questions. But first, I want to point out from our favorite Mongolian resident, appropriately. Yeah, this is the Genghis Khan quote. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. I don't know if you need a Giga Chad or President Trump's face on there, but there you go. That's the quote. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on here to some questions. How are these protesters able to keep even the base level number of protests going? Surely they must have jobs or lives outside non-stop riots. Yeah, well, they do it because people are motivated to go out and protest. That's just a left-wing tactic. Protest, their favorite thing to do. So I think, first of all, it's kind of there's a lot of social conditioning that happens on the left and the right. But people on the left are socially conditioned. That's kind of the norm. And there's just a psychological desire to adhere to the norm in many cases. And that's protesting. So I think they've just been conditioned over decades to immediately resort to protest. So I think that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is people are just motivated. They think that there's powers in numbers, and power in numbers, they can send a signal to DC, or they can, and you know what? It's not even about sending a signal to DC. It has been about sending a signal to their reps, their representatives in Congress. Because when their reps look at their city and they say, oh, 100,000 people showed up, that's a lot of voters. And one of the stated goals of these Indivisible protest campaigns has been to send a message to Democrats and get them to do more. And when these Democrat members of Congress understand that they have a mass support of people back in their districts supporting them to be more aggressive, to take a harder line stance against the Trump administration, they're more likely to do that. So I think they see a lot of benefits in these mass protests. And then, you know, of course, some of them are paid. They're just straight up paid. But I don't think pay is the largest issue. I think there's intrinsic motivation there. They're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. They think that protest is going to lead to more favorable outcome. Also, on a strategic level, there is the understanding that you have to mass protest, and that's basically a gauge. If you have a lot of people turning up to protests, then you have a much larger pool of people from which you can draw into civil disobedience or nonviolent direct action. You've also got to gauge the level of support. Do all these people who are turning out to protest, do they support escalation? And if you have a substantial 15, 25, 30% of this mass protest movement supporting escalation, then it's going to be sustainable. So I think that's also another factor to consider here. The escalation factor, which you got to start with protests. So there's maybe a few reasons. Regarding strategic non-cooperation, unrestricted warfare, well, those are two different things, but what do you see as a reaction to this? How will the administration counter it, or will other citizens rise up against them? Well, there's a huge risk of the Trump administration doing too much to oppose these groups. And one of the things that we have seen is actually a desire to trigger a Trump administration response. It basically any insurgency on earth, at least in the past 50 years, that's been basically insurgents wake up every day and they say, oh, how can we bait the occupation force? How can we bait the opponent, the counterinsurgent, into overreacting, into killing people, injuring people, doing something that the public would not agree with? And that's how the insurgent builds support for his cause. They say, yeah, I mean, we're insurgents. Yeah, of course we're violent. But we're being violent because these people are fascists or because the government is oppressive. And if you don't want to live under their oppression anymore, then you support us, or at least don't oppose us. And when you get, there's I think a misconception. Popular support is absolutely important. These movements, whether it's a protest movement, direct action movement, nonviolent, or insurgent movement, revolutionary movement, you do have to have the support of the people. But there is an asterisk there. You don't need popular support as long as you have acquiescence. And when people acquiesce to you, they may not actively support you, may not even passively support you. But if you can just gain their acquiescence, if you can just have them say, you know what, I'm not going to interfere with what you do, while also opposing the government, that's pretty much as good as popular support in many cases. So that's, I think probably some percentage of Americans probably fall into that category. And, I don't have polling data. That's just kind of a gut expectation here. As far as other citizens rising up against these, we have not seen many, I can't recall. I'm sure there have been counter protests or counter demonstrations, but not like we saw from 2016, 17 in, that era. Will that happen? It could. I don't expect that to be the main course of action. What we know works, and we know this from Colombia, and we know this from the campus occupations, the pro-Palestine campus occupations that we've seen over the past couple of years. What works is arresting people who break the law, charging them, and putting them in jail if they're found guilty. And then if you can find conspiracy, slapping RICO charges on them or conducting a RICO investigation, that works. That's probably what the DOJ needs to stick to. And otherwise, if they're not violating the law, see, here's the thing about power. Okay, so there's power and there's the illusion of power. Mass protests can give the illusion of power. You say, oh, we had 3 million people turn out for our protests last weekend. The exercise of power results in submission. You're forcing someone else to submit to your will. If you're exercising power and you're not causing anyone to submit to your will, you don't have actual power. You have the illusion of power. It's like you're on a stationary bicycle and you're pedaling. And yeah, you're exercising, but you're not going anywhere. That's the illusion of cycling. So the question is, for these movements, what does real power look like? And real power is going to look like forcing the other side to submit. And these protests have not forced anyone to submit. Maybe they have encouraged Democrats at some level. Maybe they have encouraged some Republicans to not be as brazen in their support for Trump. If they're in a district where maybe they win by a point or two, maybe they don't want to anger those constituents. So maybe that is having some limited power, but it has not been politically significant yet, I don't think. But they're trying to get there. All right, let's move on. Are conservatives and Democrats just going to go back and forth with this strategic non-cooperation against the administration in power? Strategic non-cooperation is just not a conservative or right-wing tactic. Someone said that, I don't even remember who said this, but they said it and it's absolutely true. The right views conflict or violence as a switch. It's either on or it's off. There's no halfway on. It's on, it's off. The left views violence and conflict as a dial. It can be turned up, it can be turned back down. Turned up, turned. So in terms of what happens with conservative opposition or conservative dissidents versus a left-wing president and vice versa, it depends. Anytime we talk about conflict, we're talking about three things. So first of all, fault lines. This political divide, the ideological divide, is absolutely a fault line. And really it's not. For a long time, it was political and ideological and economic, because you had class conflict, okay, the haves versus the have-nots. But increasingly, since the Obama administration, certainly, we've got this larger religious divide. That's a fault line. We've got a much larger racial or ethnic divide. That's a fault line. Matt Bracken talks about the rural-urban divide. So there's just a lot of division in this country. And what happens is when you have those fault lines rub against each other, you get tremors. Those are the tectonic plates of society shifting rubbing against each other. And that causes friction. That causes problems, causes civil unrest. If that continues to happen, then if that continues to happen, now we call that acceleration. This is acceleration of conflict. So that could be media coverage. I saw someone ask about, does the media play a role or something to that effect? Of course they do. Of course, the media exists to agitate. And we saw years and years of worth of agitation from 2015 to 2020. And so, yes, the media obviously plays a massive role. Remember, the media exists to condition. A lot of people think the news is there to inform, and that's partially true. But really, the news is marketing and marketing is conditioning. They're trying to condition beliefs. Influence is the power of getting someone to adopt a belief. And so, yes, the media plays an absolutely vital role. I wouldn't necessarily say a color revolution is dependent on cooperative media, but it sure helps. You have to have some agitator. And maybe that's not traditional media. Maybe that's social media. Maybe that's, something local. I would say it's important, but probably not critical. All right, let's go back to the three things here. So you got fault lines, you got accelerators of conflict, and then you got trigger events. Jared, can you go back to that last question, please? And then you've got trigger events. So this is like Lexington and Concord, Fort Sumter, MLK assassination, George Floyd. You have this event that is so incendiary, either literally or figuratively, because part of this acceleration phase is you're building pressure up inside a system. One reason why I didn't think 2025 was going to pop off into Summer of Love 2.0, because there was not enough pressure built up. We didn't have years and years worth of agitation and pressure and acceleration of conflict in 2025. But that's being built. And so once you have enough pressure inside the system, then you are primed for a trigger event. And whatever that trigger event's going to be, I don't know. Obviously not predictable. But when you get that trigger event, that's when you have that revolutionary rupture. That's when you have that pressure inside the system that's just built up, like you just put air into a balloon, and it can only take so much, and eventually it pops. So that's the left strategy, to push us into another trigger moment. And I think that's more likely than not probably going to come in 2028, not 25 or 26. I don't think you can do something like this prematurely unless we see the Trump administration just do something so egregious that that period of acceleration is accelerated, it's condensed, because you have a lot of pressure built up in the system. I don't think that's going to happen before 2028. It could. That's also why we do what we do every single day, to tell you how close we are to this event. And I just don't think we're close now. All right. Next question, Jared. Yes, on Color Revolution 1.0. Okay, listen, give me a couple weeks. I'm going to get something scheduled, and we'll do this for Forward Observer subscribers. We'll do a presentation and do a nice Q&A session for everyone. I want everyone to understand this, because this is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, literally, like week to week, we're seeing these indicators that this machine is being built. Maybe we'll do something for mid-August. How much of this is fifth-gen warfare? Trump is fascist on the left, claims of deep state corruption on the right, pushing each base towards losing overall trust in government. You know, Rick, I think that's a really good point. If you want to call it fifth-generation warfare, you want to call it PSYOP, you want to call it whatever, the inform and influence, propaganda, whatever. I think that's a very fair observation, that what it's actually doing is it is eroding trust, probably not just against each other, but probably in the whole system, which is obviously concerning. How much of this is fifth-gen warfare? You know, I don't know. I couldn't say, but obviously it is narrative driven. It's ideology driven. At some point, there probably is some foreign influence, we know, I'm not sure it's been politically significant, but we know there has been foreign information. I mean, we're always subjected to foreign information operations. But the thing is, it's not even a country as a wide, it's a country as a whole. It is the target audience. You have a foreign power. The foreign power doesn't say, "Oh, we're gonna try to influence every American." No, they're gonna look for a group or a subgroup. They're a particular type of people. It's called their target audience, and they say, "These are the channels we're going to use. This is the message we are going to use, and this is what we want them to do." Or maybe they work backwards. They say, "This is what we want them to do. This is the message we need to give them. And then this is the channel that we're going to push this message through." So that part of fifth gen warfare is certainly happening. I can't tell you to what degree, but I know some people who could. Maybe we'll ask them. Next question. Jared, this is definitely a you question. China's shipbuilding capacity will cause every navy to be dwarfed once war happens. Jared, is that a reason to obviously target these Chinese shipbuilding facilities?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much. Everybody makes a huge deal out of the Chinese shipbuilding capacity, and it's impressive, but it is also highly dependent on not being at war. So I think this is actually an incorrect assessment. And one thing to really keep in mind here is that China doesn't produce a lot of its own raw materials. It must refine them and then manufacture from there. So like most of the steel it gets, it makes it, but it makes it from raw material from outside of China. And so as you see steel manufacturing moving out of China, you'll also see that shipbuilding capacity start to wane. It'll at least get more expensive. That may not necessarily shut down on rate. But I think the most important factor when it comes to shipbuilding capacity in war, China has one coast and is within striking distance of every enemy. So yes, their shipbuilding capacity is incredible, but it's also extremely vulnerable. So if you have that shipbuilding capacity, the moment they open up homeland strikes with any of the Asian enemies that they've got, you're going to see these shipyards targeted, if not see the actual harbors mined. So the shipbuilding capacity will largely be mitigated in a war.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Glad you're here, Jared. Great answer. All right, listen, Jared, can you save the rest of the questions for tomorrow? We are almost at an hour. Hey, listen, everyone, we certainly appreciate your support. Thanks for being here and watching us. If this is your first time here, we do this Monday through Friday. We try to give the best, most comprehensive intelligence brief available without a top secret security clearance. We're all former intel guys, and we do this because Americans just need to understand what's going on. And by and large, you're definitely not getting the full picture. And in many cases, you're not getting any significant part of the picture either from other sources. That's why we exist here at Forward Observer, to reduce uncertainty about the future. And once we understand what the future looks like, we can be prepared for it. That's our whole mission here at Forward Observer, is to get people prepared for the future through understanding first. So we appreciate you watching. If you've been around for a while, I highly encourage you, go to forwardobserver.com. That's our website. Go sign up, free 7-day trial, get access to everything we do behind the paywall. And I will schedule this. We'll do this for mid-August. We're going to do another kind of color revolution update. And maybe I just make this a monthly thing. Try to gauge how close we are. I'll tell you exactly what I'm seeing build and talk about what's next so that you can anticipate what's next. Because listen, this is like baking a cake. Okay. We know what the ingredients looks like. We generally know how they need to be mixed. We generally know how long it's going to take to bake it. But I can't tell you exactly what minute it's going to come out of the oven. But if we do something like this each month, kind of like a color revolution monthly update, it's like turning the light on in the oven. We're going to be able to see how close we are. So with that, everyone, thanks again for your support. Go be a Forward Observer subscriber, Forward Observer member. Support our mission here, and we will continue to do our absolute best to keep you aware of what's going on around the world and at home. Talk about the things that matter, that affect you in the future. And with that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. Again, we'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.